of Appraisal and Description at the Maryland State Archives, and I'm also co-chair to the CoSA SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, which focuses on LOCKSS, which stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe, and the ways it could help state archives preserve electronic records of enduring value. Before we get started, I just want to give a couple of announcements. This webinar is a part of SERI's Spring 2019 webinar series, and listed on this slide are several of our next offerings. In April, we will focus on blockchain technology as it relates to public record keeping. In May, we have a presentation on extraction of gubernatorial records and accompanying metadata from an intranet quorum system. And in June, we'll look at Alabama's development of policies and protocols for managing, preserving, and providing access to electronic gubernatorial records. We won't have any webinars in July or August, but we will return in fall 2019. As the schedule is finalized, we'll spread the word on CoSA's website, listservs, and monthly news briefs. So please stay tuned. I also want to call your attention to a new resource we have available, created by the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee. We started with the Library of Congress's Digital Preservation Outreach and Education curriculum, and then we expanded that to cover the specific needs of state archives. It's called Managing Digital Content Over Time, and it is a series of videos that discuss the core activities associated with digital preservation. Topics include identification of the digital content that you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing the content appropriately, protecting it from loss or alteration, managing it over time, and providing access. The videos are modular, self-paced, and always available. We hope they'll be a useful resource, especially for those new to digital preservation. You'll find them on the website of the Utah State Archives, which very graciously provided technical support for the creation and is currently hosting them on behalf of CoSA. There's a link here on the screen, and a link was also included in the February CoSA news brief. Of course, today's webinar will also be linked from CoSA's website. And speaking of the website, the webinar, let's get right to the topic at hand. Please note that we are going to hold all questions until the end, but do type them into the chat box on the right side of the screen throughout the presentation. Our presenter today is Nicholas Taylor, the Program Manager for LOCKSS and Web Archiving. Nicholas manages the provision of distributed digital preservation software and services used by more than 100 institutions across multiple networks, including the Global LOCKSS Network and the CLOCKSS Archive. His previous decade of experience features a myriad of technical roles in research libraries, including Stanford Library, the Library of Congress, and the U.S. Supreme Court Library. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Nicholas Taylor.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction and the opportunity to speak with CoSA members today. I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about LOCKSS. So here's a survey of some recent news headlines about data loss. If you follow the news, you'll see with some regularity examples of data that is lost due to mistakes made by privileged insiders, by attacks by insiders and outsiders, by organizational failure, and other similar reasons. I think that these kinds of examples have everything to do with what we're trying to do with digital preservation. We may traditionally be more concerned with things like bit rot and obsolescence, but over the long term, mistakes and attacks and organizational failure are some of the factors that we really need to be concerned with when we're trying to think about how do we ensure the persistence of data for the long term. And so it's with a particular concern for these and the many other kinds of threats that face the persistence of data over the long term that motivated us to create the LOCKSS system, recognizing that bit preservation is actually really hard. It's not a solved problem. And the architecture of systems that are designed to preserve data for the long term really need a robust threat model that is informed by what the actual leading threats to digital information are. And so we don't underestimate people making mistakes, attacks on information, and organizational failure as reasons for the loss of data and things that we need to protect against. So backing up a second, what is LOCKSS? LOCKSS is unfortunately used to mean a number of different things. So LOCKSS is a principle. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So a best practice around redundancy is a means of protecting data. LOCKSS is also the name of a program, an administrative unit of Stanford libraries. We've been operating continuously for 20 years. LOCKSS is also the name of the open source software that was built and principally maintained by the LOCKSS program at Stanford libraries. It provides peer-to-peer digital preservation. And then lastly, LOCKSS is also a community. So it's a community of institutions and communities that are running LOCKSS networks or otherwise using LOCKSS technologies to affect digital preservation and maintain digital preservation capacity and skill. But LOCKSS is a lot more than the name implies, sort of lots of copies keeping stuff safe, because lots of copies is necessary but not sufficient for ensuring the longevity of digital information. What we're particularly concerned about are central points of failure. So if you have a single system that is managing multiple copies, then all of those copies can be corrupted at once if there are central points of failure. So examples may be, a privileged insider can affect all the copies at once, or perhaps all of the copies are stored on storage media that was created at the same factory, and a bug was introduced into the process of manufacturing those devices, and so they're all subject to the same kinds of errors. And so the LOCKSS architecture is really about diversification, trying to figure out how we can make our information resilient against those single points of failure. What does the LOCKSS system provide? It provides continual integrity checking and repair. So this is a routine operation in LOCKSS rather than something that you do periodically or is a nice to have. This is automatic and baked into the way that LOCKSS works. That those operations take place between mutually distrusting independent peers. So each of the nodes in a LOCKSS network inherently distrust the integrity assertions that are made by the other nodes in the network. And so in this way, it maintains a high degree of skepticism and is able to provide a high degree of information integrity assurance. And then another key feature of LOCKSS is that the network is something that your community controls. So this isn't a model where you're taking your data, you're handing it off to a third party, and then you're relying on the third party's attestations of the preservation status of your information. We are working with our partners, communities, and institutions for them to run infrastructure that allows them to maintain local custody, maintain local IT control, but still have the assurance of a high degree of preservation service. I mentioned that audit and repair operations are a routine part of the way that LOCKSS works. We believe that in order to ensure the integrity of data over the long term, you have to look at it, and you have to look at it with some frequency because it's important to find out quickly that data has been compromised so that you can repair it sooner from the remaining good copies. There's always a danger that if one copy goes bad, that other copies will go bad too before you detect any of them, and then you lose the opportunity to perform those repairs. The way that this works in a highly simplified way is that the nodes within a LOCKSS network conduct polls to validate the integrity of the distributed copies. So rather than relying on a canonical centralized fixity store, which again would represent a single point of failure and would similarly be subject to the same kinds of digital preservation risks that the content that it is meant to protect are subject to, we rely on a consensus mechanism. And so the more copies you have in the LOCKSS network, the more security that provides, because more of the nodes can be down on a temporary or permanent basis. More of the copies can end up being corrupted, but the polls will still conclude with a majority consensus, always telling you, or always telling the LOCKSS system, which of the copies are to be trusted and in which direction repairs should take place. Another key feature of the LOCKSS architecture is the social piece, not so much the technical piece, although they're closely aligned, and that's the idea of communities. Communities are an important complement for LOCKSS and for digital preservation generally. Organizational failure is such a big cause for the loss of data. Having a committed community, committed groups of institutions that are together preserving content provides resilience against the failure of any of those organizations. And when I say organizational failure, I don't just mean that that organization ceases to exist. I mean also that there may be temporary lapses in funding that would result in, like if you were paying for the hosting of content on a third-party platform, you have to sustain the payment to that platform in order for hosting to continue. And in the LOCKSS model, since you always have custody, it's less vulnerable to those kinds of dips in funding. Having multiple organizations committed to the preservation of content also provides for heterogeneity and diversity, again, minimizing those central points of failure. So diversity in terms of financial models and business models, and also technical architecture. Preservation is an active community effort, so it's really important that the community be invested on an ongoing basis in sustaining preservation. Part of what we're looking to do through LOCKSS is to build and sustain local distributed capacity, because we really feel that this is, as memory institutions, this is a key part of our role, is stewarding content and stewarding collections, and we want to try to help the community to sustain that capacity for themselves as much as possible. And so we talk about the C in LOCKSS is not just meaning lots of copies keep stuff safe, but also lots of communities keep stuff safe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how LOCKSS works to make this perhaps a little more tangible. So LOCKSS is a distributed digital preservation system, so that makes it a little bit different. In this, we are aligning with best practice, such as you might see in the NDSA levels of digital preservation, which talk about, having 3 or more copies, having them geographically separated. We're taking that a step further and trying to find, any possible dimension on which we can diversify the context in which those copies are stored. And in doing this, we mean to achieve a resilience for our digital preservation that's not possible with any sort of centralized solution. Ways in which institutions are using LOCKSS networks, they use it either as a dedicated preservation solution. So in some cases, institutions that are participating in LOCKSS networks, that's essentially the only place that they're doing digital preservation. In other cases, they have some digital preservation services locally, and they're using a LOCKSS network to supplement that for some subsets of content, perhaps their most important materials. Some of the things that are particular to LOCKSS among other digital preservation service providers, we are strongly research-based. If you go to our website under the About section, there's a whole section called Resources, which has a lot of our early open access and peer-reviewed literature where we lay out our threat model. We do some pretty heavy-duty computer science research that explains the operation of the polling mechanism, and just generally speaking, the fundamental architecture of the software is highly based in computer science research on security and threat minimization and cryptography. We have a well-articulated threat model that's very robust. So that includes the kinds of risks that you would typically be concerned about, things like bit rot and media failure and obsolescence, but it also includes things that are less traditionally there, like internal and external attack, people making mistakes, or organizational failure. Those figure large in the kinds of threats that we're trying to mitigate through our architecture. And then lastly, we support local custody. So while we are exploring some models of that are more hosted, we always want to retain the possibility for the institutions that are using LOCKSS technologies to use those technologies to sustain local capacity and maintain local custody, because that's an important part of how this works. Here's the rough content lifecycle for content in LOCKSS. So you're ingesting content, you're then managing it, it's preserved in the system, and then there's some mechanisms for providing access. On the ingestion side, LOCKSS was originally built as a web archiving and digital preservation system. The original use case was web-based scholarly publications, and so it has historically had a bit of a bias towards web harvest as a means of ingest. That is starting to change. We're in the midst of a major software re-architecture, which should provide additional flexibility in terms of workflow integration with other curation and digital preservation systems, as well as moving away from web harvest as the exclusive means for getting content into the system. Once the content is in, there's a web accessible user interface that you can use to monitor preservation activity. And in some networks, particularly those that are focused on scholarly publications, there are more seamless ways to be able to select new content for archiving. Once the content is into the system, the main and most important operations of the LOCKSS software are to perform ongoing preservation operations. A few key points about how this works is that each of the nodes in the network will go and independently retrieve content from the trusted source. So again, this is helping to maintain the independence of each of the nodes participating in the network. Once that content is stored, the audit and repair operations start taking place automatically, and those continue on an ongoing basis. Lastly, there are mechanisms for delivering the content. The system can be configured in a proxy server mode, in a web server mode, or integrated in OpenURL and an OpenURL resolver. These are, again, biased towards the original use case of scholarly publications, but we are building additional sort of access affordances in the context of the current re-architecture. A little more about setup, support, and costs to give you some idea of what it would mean to set up a LOCKSS network. So the first thing you would do is you would organize your community, and community defined however you might, around content of shared concern. So what is content that a group of institutions have a shared interest in preserving? Would you be interested in undertaking preservation together using LOCKSS network as a approach? We will consult with you on fit, so evaluate whether or not LOCKSS seems to be a good technical solution here, what other technical requirements you may have, and most importantly, workflow integration. So where is the data, and what will be the sustainable workflows by which you're going to get that data into the preservation system. We would then work with you on a pilot implementation. So that would include a subset of nodes, perhaps some pilot nodes that we set up on our end to help test. We would use that to validate the workflows and the tooling to get necessary reporting or things like that for your use case. We would move on from there into a production implementation. We provide ongoing support, so we would obviously help set up the network, set up the integration for the workflows, and then we provide ongoing support for management and maintenance of the nodes, upgrading the software, training, and other integrations, access, things like that. Participants are asked to join the LOCKSS Alliance. So this may be either your community joins the LOCKSS Alliance or your individual institutions. That's an annual fee that helps us to sustain the support that we provide and to continue to upgrade the core software for the benefit of all of the users who are using the LOCKSS software, as well as folks who may download it's open source, so it's freely available our model is to charge for service and support around that software. Depending on the level of work to set up the network, there may be additional charges just for staff time recovery to be able to get the network set up. So there are a couple of options for using LOCKSS. One of them is to start a new network, which is what I just described. Another option is to look at existing networks, see if some of them have a collection focus that overlaps with the kind of content that you're interested in preserving, and perhaps reach out to them about joining an existing network. For starting a new network, we recommend a minimum of four nodes. This goes back to kind of the purposeful way in which the LOCKSS system uses those copies, right, to maintain consensus, to establish consensus and to hold votes. Stanford Libraries, is in a position to host nodes if your community is 2 institutions or 3 institutions and you need to have a quorum with another independent partner. It's also an option to join an existing network, and for that we have a list of the dozen or so networks that exist on our website. I think these slides will be distributed, so you can click on this link in the slide deck, or you can go to the website directly and find those. And I encourage you to reach out to those network communities directly to see if there might be a possibility of joining them. We're also looking at how to better support the needs of individual organizations that aren't aligned with a logical community. So we're occasionally approached by organizations that are looking to preserve content, and our solution is really community-based, and so we're not in a good position to be able to serve them, and we're looking at ways where we can sort of extend the co-hosting model with a number of other trusted institutions to be able to provide something that's more like a hosted service while still allowing institutions to have a local LOCKSS box and local custody. I'm going to talk a little bit more about, in depth, about some of the LOCKSS use cases that have emerged over the 20 years that we've been operating. So the original animating use case for LOCKSS was post-cancellation access for scholarly electronic resources. So what that means is that if a research library subscribes to an electronic journal and they cancel that journal, they may have provisions in their contract that would assure that they should continue to have access to the materials that they've purchased even though they've canceled. This was largely how things worked in the era of print journal holdings, right? So the library would purchase the print journal holdings, they would then have local custody of them, and that local custody was irrevocable, unmodifiable, regardless of what happened to the publisher subsequently, regardless of what happened to the contract that the library had with the publisher, they would know that they always had those copies of the journal. And so LOCKSS, in the form of the Global LOCKSS Network, was a mechanism for reinstantiating that same kind of model for electronic resources by ensuring that the library would be able to take local custody of a copy of the content that they had purchased, and in a network with a bunch of other libraries that were doing the same, those nodes in the network could all confer with one another and assure that the content remained intact and repair as needed on an ongoing basis. And so that network is still in operation, and let's see if there are any points that I didn't cover here. So that provided for local custody, lots of decentralized copies, and collectively these libraries are better assuring the preservation of the scholarly record at whole, and we're also helping to sustain the role of the library as a steward of their collections. So other librarians picked up on the core sort of functionality of the LOCKSS software and realized that this isn't actually specific to scholarly publications. It's actually generalizable to any type of digital content. And so they started to apply LOCKSS for other use cases. And one of the first ones was government information. So there are a couple of networks that are operating that are focused specifically on government information. There's the Canadian Government Information Digital Preservation Network and the Digital Federal Depository Library Program, or LOCKSS US Docs. And so depending on how you look at it, these programs are partnerships with government agencies or hedges to ensure permanent access to government information. So CGI was motivated by the Harper administration in Canada, taking content down from government websites, taking government websites down, and the government information librarians in Canada determined that they needed to re-decentralize that information to ensure that there would continue to be access to it. The LOCKSS US Docs program is focused specifically on the output of the GPO FDSys program, but it has dozens of participants, and it was meant to, in the same way that the Global LOCKSS Network was recreating a system of distributed custody for electronic journals, the LOCKSS US Docs Network is reinstantiating distributed custody of federal publications, replacing the Federal Depository Library program that was focused on distributing print. So a little bit more about LOCKSS and government information, sort of why LOCKSS might be a particularly good use case for that. So when we're talking about public or publishable content, it seems like in the last few years, particularly around federal government information, there's been a large community of interested organizations and communities and individuals. LOCKSS provides the possibility for open, extensible networks because you don't necessarily have to trust any of the organizations that join into the network. It's highly extensible and it's easy to tap community enthusiasm for a given set of content to create an open network. For private and protected content, it's also possible to set up, of course, closed LOCKSS networks that aren't open to external participants. And some of the features here that might align with some of the use cases that CoSA members are keen on, so maintaining local IT control as well as jurisdictional determination of storage. So you can partner with institutions that have a very clear geography and are storing the content on premise, and you're maintaining local IT control in a system that is more transparent to you than putting it into a third-party black box. And then for both of the use cases, it's important to emphasize that LOCKSS provides high standards for data integrity assurance. I think in terms of external certifications, I could point to the CLOCKSS archive, which is the only LOCKSS-based track certified repository, and they receive the highest marks for security and technical excellence, a 5 out of 5, as well as currently the highest track score given by CRL, 14 out of 15, which is one shy of a perfect score. So the last use case I was going to mention is all content, essentially varied content, digitized, born digital, and there are a number of networks that have sort of a broad focus in terms of the content that goes into their networks. So these include the Alabama Digital Preservation Network, the Meta Archive Cooperative, and the Westfault Network up in Canada. And so these networks preserve all types of content. It includes special collections as well as records. They operate on a couple of different service models, and I think this is important to highlight. So there's certainly LOCKSS networks where all of the depositors also host infrastructure. So the Global LOCKSS Network, for example, all of the participants in that network, what it means to participate in the network is that they all host a node themselves. But increasingly, especially for these networks, they're moving in the direction of more of a super node architecture where there's a larger community, but a subset of organizations in that community host the LOCKSS infrastructure and then use that to serve the whole community. So the local custody that LOCKSS is supporting is local to the community, but it's only local to a subset of the institutions, with the other institutions in the community using those institutions as their service providers. So LOCKSS enables a diversity of business models and governance models, but critically, it allows for the governance and infrastructure to both be community-based and in alignment. it turns out I have one more use case. So the last use case I was going to talk about is web archive co-preservation. So we have a pilot network that's focused on this. This is the Ivy Plus Libraries Confederation Preservation Network. They have a collaborative program focused on web content collecting, and they're piloting a network. Given that the web content collecting is highly centralized in Internet Archive's infrastructure, in Archivist, which is the predominant way by which institutions are carrying out web archiving, LOCKSS networks would seem to be a natural complement because, especially for collaborative efforts, because they're a way of, again, re-decentralizing the custody of that information and thereby better assuring its preservation, especially given the sort of highly centralized and dependent on one organization nature of web archiving. What's also interesting about this pilot network is that it's more of a co-preservation model, sort of moving towards co-hosting or a hosting model. So it's a 4-node network. There are 2 Ivy Plus web content collecting program participants, as well as Stanford Libraries and Internet Archive. So Internet Archive is serving as the content host, but they're also leveraging the copies they already have to participate in a preservation network with other institutions that have a shared interest in the preservation of that content. Okay, so that's the bulk of the presentation. I had a couple of slides of wrap up. So things that I'm hoping that you take away from this presentation today, that there are many threats to the long-term persistence of digital content, and that it's important in thinking about, whatever your strategy is or whatever your solution is, don't discount the impact of attacks, mistakes, and organizational failure, because those, over the long term, those are going to make a big difference, perhaps a bigger difference for the longevity of the information we care about than the kinds of things that we're often preoccupied with. LOCKSS, though it started as a system for preserving scholarly publications, it's important to know that it's now used to preserve all types of content, including government information. There's more information about that and much more on our website. There's a whole section about case studies. We redid our website last fall, and it has a whole new look, and there's a lot of information there. And if you haven't paid attention to LOCKSS in a while, I would encourage you to go check that out. Please reach out to us if you have any questions or ideas on how we can work together. We're happy to chat further. And with that, I had, hopefully to stimulate discussion, some questions, and I'm open to your feedback. I'm interested in hearing about what is the content that you are looking to preserve, what are the threats you're concerned about, who are other institutions or communities who might have a shared interest in preserving the content that you care about, what are the constraints that you're working within around being able to disseminate copies or share preservation responsibility, and just generally, what are your possibilities for engaging in preservation in a more collaborative way? And with that, I will turn it back over to Catherine, and I welcome any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Excellent information. Anybody with questions or perhaps with answers to Nicholas's questions, please type them into the chat box on the right of your screen. As we're waiting for our attendees to gather their thoughts, I had a question for you, Nicholas. Is LOCKSS designed only for records that you want to keep permanently, or is there some provision for destroying records if you only want to keep it for a set amount of time and then dispose of them?
Yeah, that's a really good question and an interesting one, because I guess like in the records use case, you might have a schedule, right, that requires that expects that you retire it at a certain point. So we don't, for very principled reasons, we have not built mechanisms into the software that readily facilitates the expungement or purging or deletion of content from the network, because we don't want to introduce security holes, as it were, that would make it easier for someone to compromise the system, take over the system, or leverage the system to carry out deletion of content in anything like an efficient manner. So I would say that for the moment, LOCKSS has been specifically engineered to ensure that content that's put in is going to stay in, and it's going to treat any attempt to remove content as essentially as it would an insider attack. But yeah, I can see how that would be an important feature for some kinds of records use cases.
Well, that certainly makes sense that you will, in order to protect what's there, make it so that it's only for records you want to keep permanently.
Yes. Good question.
I was particularly interested when you were talking about using LOCKSS to preserve government publications. I know that is a challenge we've been seeing in Maryland as agencies move away from print publications, and the mechanisms that were in place to distribute and preserve those print mechanisms, we're having to come up with a whole new way to make sure that we're preserving government publications that are electronic.
I think that yeah, that makes sense, and I think that that's, from what I understand with my web archiving hat, that the move of print resources in general to online only is one of the strong motivating use cases for web archiving. I think that there's a natural complementarity and partnership between Archivist and LOCKSS, especially as Archivist has increasingly sort of dominates the web archiving marketplace. I think the NDSA web archiving surveys show that at least in the US and maybe also Canada, that Archivist is, for 95% of responding institutions is the primary way that they do web archiving. So what this means is that we are collectively as a community, like, putting our trust in the persistence of those web archives in a single institution with a relatively limited geographic footprint in a highly consolidated architecture, and so I think LOCKSS is a natural complement there for ensuring the preservation of that content.
And here we have a question from Sarah Kuntz. Are there any uses or networks for local government records preservations, as that seems like another community who cares about the preservation of content that the state archival community cares about?
Yes. So I think that the Alabama Digital Preservation Network has some. They also have local libraries, like municipal libraries or county, participating in their preservation network. And so I haven't checked recently to see what are the specific assets in the network, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were storing sort of more local government kinds of information there. That's the only example that I'm aware of, though.
It does seem like an excellent opportunity for archives to work with different organizations or different levels of government. It really does, as you say, it encourages the community aspect of preservation.
I mean, I think there's a bit of a challenge around the sort of focus on maintaining local infrastructure is both, it's good for digital preservation, but it's a little bit of a barrier too. And so I think that the model that some networks are exploring of supernodes, where you could have a larger community of aligned institutions with a shared interest in, the same set of content, where, the better IT resourced organizations in the network are the ones who are providing the infrastructure, but you have a wider group of institutions that are contributing content. And I think that, those kinds of partnerships between state archival institutions and local institutions, I think, could be fruitful if the governance and the financial and business models can be worked out, could be fruitful for helping to ensure the preservation of more local government information and records. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it seems like there's also an opportunity here to have collaboration between the primary record creators and the primary record users.
Yeah, that's another good example or partnership, right? Kind of in maybe following that model of the way that Internet Archive is sort of a content source in some sense for the Web Archive content, but they're also participating in the preservation network. So maybe the replicable part of that model is not just co-hosting, but it's in the records context, enlisting the organizations that are providing the information to also be participants. I can't remember if in the LOCKSS US Docs network, whether GPO is running a box, for example. I think they might be.
All right. Well, I think that covers everybody's questions. And I want to thank you again, Nicholas, for the excellent presentation. And I want to thank all the attendees for coming. When you leave the webinar, you will be asked to do a short survey, and we do ask that you do fill that out, as it's very helpful to us. And also, here is information on staying connected and informed on CoSA events like future webinars. So please follow along so that you can join us in the future. Oh, wait, I think I had a question come in from Mary Johnson. You mentioned the fact that LOCKSS isn't designed for records that would be expunged at some defined time. What does that mean with respect to an organization that at some time might want to withdraw?
So I think that would be a question of what is the governance for that network. So the fact that the organizations themselves are hosting the content means that, you know, if they decided that, okay, well, we have a different solution in the future for the storage of our records, then there's no reason that they couldn't, you know, turn off their lock system, or, you know, we can help them to export the content out of the lock system in a format that, you know, they would want to migrate it to some other system. So I think the use of locks is meant to conserve the organization's ability to sort of choose the disposition of their content into the future. The fact that they have local custody means that, you know, they always have control, right? They can always do what they want with it.
That was an excellent question. From Allie Brady, will this webinar be available online at some point in the future? Yes, it will. This webinar is being recorded and will be available through the CoSA website, as Rebecca Joelson posted the link here in the chat box.
So if there's any other questions you think of or information you're looking for, please feel free to reach out to us directly.
All right. Well, thank you again, Nicholas, for presenting for us today.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all the attendees for coming.